Before we start the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people of the Wiradjuri Nation, because it's on their ancestral lands that this academy is built. And as we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning and research, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. So, good morning, one and all, distinguished guests, fellows, friends of the Academy. Welcome to Science at the Shine Dome 2014, and what a beautiful, freshly minted, rather crisp day we have in Canberra. I think this annual event is a really wonderful opportunity to welcome our new fellows and medalists, catch up with colleagues, and rejoice in vibrant and inspiring stories of Australian science. And on this 60th anniversary year, it's a particular pleasure to welcome you all here, to celebrate the Academy's great tradition and vibrant future, and to celebrate the outstanding contributions to the world made by Australian science. In the 1950s, before we began, Australia was a nation filled with hope and activity. After decades of suffering through the Great Depression and World War II, the 50s were prosperous and vibrant. Employment was high, and technology was advancing rapidly. In some ways, it was a golden era for science and technology in this nation. Televisions linked us culturally with the rest of the world. I can still remember sitting down in front of the first TV I ever saw. Mass-produced cars enabled greater mobility. Holden came into its own. Florey's work on penicillin had paved the way for greater control over infection, and myxomatosis had been released, wreaking havoc on the feral rabbit populations. And it was into this atmosphere of optimism and innovation that Australian Fellows of the Royal Society of London decided to establish an Australian Academy of Science. Sir Mark Oliphant had recently returned to Australia to help establish the Australian National University, following his wartime work on radar research and the Manhattan Project. Dr. David Martin was chief of the then CSIR Division of Radiophysics and chief scientist with the Radio Research Board. And both of these men wanted to establish a national outlook for science. They proved a powerful team. They enlisted the support of Sir Robert Menzies, who of course was then Prime Minister, and together with the Governor-General, Sir William Slim, Menzies promised to help prepare the new Academy's charter for the impending visit by Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh. By the time she visited in February 1954, Elizabeth had become Queen, and she presented the Royal Charter to the founding fellows of this Academy at Government House, the first time since 1662 that a reigning monarch had presented the charter of such a body in person. At the laying of the dome's foundation stone in 1958, Menzies said the following, and I quote, "If there's one thing that..." I can't do his voice, but I remember it well. "If there's one thing that shines out in the history of this century, it is the enormous capacity of science to expand its boundaries. He would be a very dull soul, I think, who didn't realise that by the end of this century, the boundaries of knowledge will have been pushed back to places as yet unseen and unimagined." And he's talking about our time now. This Academy, established by the finest body of scientists this country has ever had, adding as it will in the future to its own numbers, men and women of corresponding gifts and enthusiasm, is going to make a contribution to the body of scientific knowledge in the world. Yes, Menzies was a great supporter of science and a visionary and strategic thinker. He shepherded the foundation of Australian National University and established the Australian Universities Commission, saying, The scientist is of great and growing importance, and what we propose to do will, I believe, enable many more scientists to be trained in proper circumstances and with improved tuition, buildings, and equipment. His commission's recommendations were enthusiastically embraced by government, almost in their entirety, leading to an injection into the university research sector of hundreds of millions of dollars. Menzies also oversaw the greatest expansion in the life of CSIRO, with a tenfold expansion in its budget over the 15 years to 1965, and government-funded building of important scientific infrastructure, such as the radio telescope at Parkes and the Phytotron in Canberra. I think you'd agree with me that Australia's socio-political, economic and research landscape has changed considerably since the 1950s. I think that more than at any other time in our recent history, we face a host of challenges, any single one of which poses a strong threat to our long-term social, economic and environmental sustainability and our quality of life. Starting now, we must prepare our economy for the end of the mining boom. We must develop innovative new companies to replace failing traditional industries, companies that will grow Australia's economy sustainably in the long term and deliver the budget surpluses envisaged by government. We must address our environmental challenges and the health challenges posed by our ageing demographic. We must equip our children with an education that is rich in science and maths skills to prepare them for jobs that will increasingly rely on such skills. When the Academy was established, Canberra was just beginning to coalesce into a town from a handful of landmark buildings scattered amongst paddocks. The town was even small enough, and I must say I'm amused at this, that the social pages of the Capital's newspaper reported the holiday plans of the Academy's first chief executive, Charles Burley. I don't think they do that to you, Sue, these days, do they? And Menzies' cabinet met a number of times here in the Dome, and Oliphant and his peers made no bones about stridently advising the government on matters of scientific importance. These days, the geographic and political landscape of Canberra is very different. There are hundreds of professional lobbyists clamouring for the attention of the nation's leaders. It's a changed game, but the Academy continues to make frank, fearless and independent representations to government through a host of mechanisms, some of which I will touch upon. We continue to recommend strategic investment in education, research and development, that we build a knowledge economy, that we continue to produce and support research excellence. In the Academy's pre-budget submission to Treasury and in our pre-election and pre-budget meetings with political leaders, we asked our nation's political leaders to show leadership, to set high expectations, and to signal that Australian science is open for business. We asked the government to help make Australia the best place in the world to conduct world-class research and innovation. We argued for continuing the Future Fellowship Scheme, strategically funding research infrastructure, re-establishing an international science linkages program, and supporting quality science education. I met a month ago with the Prime Minister before the final budget decisions to put the case for a long-term strategic approach to research and R&D in Australia, and I was actually really heartened by his positive reaction. I emphasised in that meeting that Australia's relatively low and falling level of investment in R&D is of real concern, that it threatens the nation's long-term prosperity. Right now, Australia is languishing at 13th place amongst OECD nations in terms of the percentage of GDP that we invest in R&D. We're at 2.2% and falling, compared with 3.3% in Japan and 4.4% in Korea. And yet our neighbours have had far more difficult financial and economic problems to contend with over the past 6 years than Australia has had. When he took power, Prime Minister Abbott said that his government would, and I quote, provide the long-term stable policies and vision that our nation's scientists and researchers need to excel in their work. Sadly, the budget handed down 2 weeks ago did not fulfil this promise. There was, of course, some good news. The Academy is very welcoming of interim funding for national research infrastructure, but it is only for 1 year at this stage. We also welcome new ongoing commitment to the Future Fellowships Program for mid-career researchers, that's very important, and additional support for agricultural research and development corporations. And happily too, the Academy's education programs have been supported, and pre-budget concerns about cuts to Australia's Antarctic research were not entirely realised. And of course, as a medical researcher, I couldn't help but be thrilled by the proposal for a big new medical research future fund, although I strongly question the means proposed to support it. But sadly, this kind of long-term and visionary thinking was not applied elsewhere. Instead, the budget brought cuts of more than $420 million from the vital Australian science agencies, CSIRO, the Defence Science and Technology Organisation, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, Geoscience Australia, NICTA, the Australia Research Council, and the Cooperative Research Centres program. On top of this, the environment will suffer. Clean energy, water research, and climate change research have all been subjected to substantial cuts. The vision promised by the Future Fund for Medical Research needs broadening. The pipeline must be strong all the way from the beginning, from the fundamental sciences through to development and application. Even if the government regards medical research as an investment priority, this kind of research is not carried out in isolation. It depends upon, builds upon, and integrates with the work of physicists, chemists, mathematicians, biologists, engineers, and researchers from many disciplines. As well, this government's intention to ask PhD students to pay tuition fees is essentially asking the next generation of scientists to pay to undertake a highly skilled apprenticeship, which is long and hard and for which they're paid very little money. This will make PhDs unattractive, even unobtainable for many, and become a huge disincentive to many, many more. We all know that our students are critical to the research enterprise. Diminish them, and Australian research will lose its engine, its powerhouse. On the whole, for science, this budget appeared to be about pulling money from lots of different programs and agencies and then reallocating but a fraction of it to others. While acknowledging that science is not alone in its pain, this is not the long-term, stable approach that this government promised science before it took power in September. In 2013-14, total science spending will come to about $8.6 billion, compared with a peak of $9.1 billion in 2011-12. With no central science portfolio, and the science budget itself spread across multiple portfolios and agencies, It's quite difficult at this time to accurately pinpoint the total spend for the coming year. But it appears to us, on first blush, as though it will slip below 8.5 billion, its lowest in 5 years. And as I mentioned earlier, nations with economies in much worse shape than ours are investing more heavily in science, not less, because they recognise that R&D represents the best hope for a healthy population and environment and a strong and innovative economy in years to come. In marked contrast, recent Australian budgets have the potential to set back by several years both Australian science and Australia's productive future. A strategic approach to science in Australia would pay careful attention to how major national research infrastructure is supported and maximised to deliver value for money as well as outstanding research outcomes. It's a great relief to have the additional NCRIS funding, but it's only a stopgap measure. We need a long-term sustainable approach to properly operating and maintaining our major research facilities and agencies. These are fundamental to the nation's research effort. The budget also failed to make any major provision for international science collaboration and diplomacy. Australia's bilateral relationship with China is extremely important, and the 10 million allocated to the Australia-China Science and Research Fund is very welcome. But what of Europe, the Americas, the rest of Asia? Australia does an enormous amount of high-quality research and certainly holds its own internationally. But we are a comparatively small bunch of researchers, and we're in geographic isolation. And we run the risk of missing vital leaps forward if we have no strategic mechanism to engage with the international research community and to access important research facilities overseas. In the absence of a coordinated national approach to international science diplomacy and linkages, we at the Academy have tried to work very hard to maintain relationships. We do this in multiple ways, through direct contact with science attachés in the embassies and high commissions of other nations in Canberra, and through Australian embassies elsewhere. We do this through formal and informal meetings and agreements with science academies of other nations, through bilateral and multilateral seminars and conferences, through hosting research exchanges and ensuring representation by young Australian researchers at the annual Lindau meeting in Germany of Nobel laureates. And in fact, at the next such meeting in end of June, thanks to the great efforts of Foreign Secretary Andrew Holmes and Nobel laureate Brian Schmidt, we'll host a special celebration of Australian science and culture to the world. We actively participate in and lead a range of international science organisations, including the International Council for Science, IAP, that's the Global Network of Science Academies, the Inter-Academy Council, and the Association of Academies and Societies of Science in Asia. And we have 22 very hard-working national committees for the different science disciplines who link us to the International Council of Science, ICSU, and its scientific unions and international and interdisciplinary bodies. Yes, the fellows, the national committees and our staff do an outstanding job, but we are a small fellowship and an even smaller secretariat working within a budget that is contracted over time. We cannot do this alone. The Academy will continue to call on government to deliver on its election promise of a long-term plan for international science collaboration. In our view, this should be a program with an investment of at least $25 million a year for 10 years, and then it should be revisited. Science is a global competition for talent. We all know that, and it's really essential that Australia is an attractive place for the brightest researchers in the world to work. This means providing opportunities at different career stages, and that's why the Future Fellowships program for mid-career researchers is so important, and why we're all so glad to see this continue. Here at the Academy, we've got a long and proud history of recognising excellence early and mid-career researchers that I'll abbreviate as EMCRs because it's a bit of a mouthful. And you'll be hearing from some of the best such researchers later this morning. We've also got a young but robust and growing program, the Australian EMCR Forum, to support the professional development of these young scientists and help them develop the other kinds of skills that are critical to their career success. And already the forum has been an absolutely wonderful success. Its inquiries and reviews have been recognised of great value, and it's assisted the Academy to incorporate early career perspectives into our own approaches to government. And they've actually developed an outstanding policy around working towards gender equity in science. I think you'd agree with me that the nation's scientific strength is vitally dependent on the quality of its education at every level. The Academy's school education programs began 50 years ago with an acclaimed series of textbooks. We've moved with the times, and our primary and junior secondary school programs that I think you're all familiar with, I certainly hope you all are, they're called Primary Connections and Science by Doing. They continue now to develop world-class interactive curriculum resources, completely digital in the case of Science by Doing. These programs of ours are fully aligned with the new national science curriculum, and most importantly, I think vitally, they're paired with professional development for teachers. Students and teachers alike are extremely positive about them, and I'm proud to say we've come a long way since the first Primary Connections units were trialled in 2005. Now, Primary Connections units are in more than 70% of all Australian primary schools, although that is not 70% of every classroom, every primary classroom in this country, and that's, I think we should aim at 100% of all primary classrooms. And in the past year alone, we've trained more than 1,000 teachers in 500 different schools. Science by Doing is a much newer program. It was only officially launched in December last year, but since then, 12,000 teachers, students and parents have registered to use it from all states and territories and in international Australian schools as well. These programs are teaching children critical thinking skills, which will become a lifelong asset, as well as teaching them science, numeracy and literacy. One of our goals is, of course, that more children will elect to study science and mathematics in years 11 and 12, deepening Australia's pool of intellectual potential and enhancing the quality of our university graduate students and eventually, of course, our scientific workforce. So I'm really pleased that the government fulfilled its commitment to continue support for our programs, and they have allocated $5 million over the next 4 years to these programs. Tomorrow, at the symposium, we'll hear from some of Australia's best-known scientists about great achievements in fields as diverse as astronomy, geoscience, chemistry, medicine, environmental science, quantum computing, agricultural science, life science, and genomics. They'll paint for us a picture of the future, the possibilities for Australia and the world as we continue to explore the frontiers of human knowledge. Menzies was right in predicting that by the beginning of this century, the boundaries of knowledge will have been pushed back to places as yet unseen and unimagined. In that great far-sighted spirit of drive and optimism, I call on the present Australian government to work with us to ensure that Australia continues to be a nation of vision, of endeavour, of knowledge creation, to create the conditions in which science may flourish for the benefit of all society, in which these exciting possibilities for the future may become reality. We are supported in this vision by our sister science academies around the world, many of whom have written in recent months to congratulate us on our 6 decades of good work for science. By comparison with the world's oldest continuing scientific academy, the 354-year-old Royal Society, this academy is but a baby. But we have come a long way and achieved much in our 60 years. This academy has been and will continue to be a strong and independent voice for science in Australia. We will continue to champion scientific excellence, to promote and disseminate scientific knowledge, and to provide independent scientific advice for the benefit of Australia and the world. Thank you.